There was a moment, a specific instant in time when money, as we've known it for over 50 years, stopped working, when the mathematical foundations of global finance collapsed, when power began shifting from those who print paper to those who control things. It happened at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on February the 2nd, 2026. In a secure conference room beneath the Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C., no cameras, no recording devices, no official record. Just 12 people who hold more economic power than entire nations, facing a mathematical reality that couldn't be solved with monetary policy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to tell you about the moment that history will mark as the end of fiat currency and the beginning of the new economic order. The moment when the people who created our monetary system admitted it was broken beyond repair and began implementing the transition to something entirely different. The meeting was supposed to last 30 minutes, a routine briefing for Federal Reserve governors about institutional capital flows and banking sector stability. Instead, it became an 8-hour emergency session that fundamentally altered the global power structure while the world slept. Fed Chair Jerome Powell called the meeting after receiving classified reports from the Treasury Department, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. All three agencies had reached the same terrifying conclusion. The American financial system was experiencing cascading failures that could not be contained using traditional policy tools. The first presentation came from Treasury officials who revealed that foreign institutional demand for U.S. government bonds had collapsed below sustainable levels, not declining gradually, but disappearing entirely. Major pension funds, sovereign wealth entities, and central banks had stopped purchasing Treasury securities altogether, leaving the Federal Reserve as the only buyer of American government debt. But the Treasury Department's briefing contained a more disturbing revelation. Their mathematical models showed that even unlimited Federal Reserve bond purchases could not stabilize government financing needs because the money printing required to buy government debt was destroying the currency faster than the debt could be issued. Think about what that means. The United States government had reached the point where they could not finance operations through borrowing because the act of financing operations destroyed the value of the money used to finance them. They had hit the mathematical limit of fiat currency systems. The second presentation came from banking regulators who reported that commercial banks had fundamentally altered their business models in ways that made traditional banking supervision impossible. Banks were no longer operating as financial intermediaries. They were functioning as physical asset holding companies that happened to have banking licenses. The regulatory officials revealed that major banks had liquidated over $2.8 trillion in traditional financial assets over the past month to purchase physical infrastructure, real estate, commodities, and production facilities. The banking system had effectively abandoned banking in favor of resource extraction and infrastructure control. But the most shocking regulatory briefing focused on payment systems. The officials reported that traditional electronic payment networks were experiencing what they called systematic bypass. Large corporations, institutional investors, and even some government entities were conducting business transactions outside conventional banking systems. Instead of using dollars transferred through bank networks, they were using direct asset swaps, commodity exchanges, precious metals transfers, and bilateral trade agreements that completely avoided the traditional monetary system. The dollar wasn't being abandoned through dramatic selling, it was being ignored through systematic irrelevance. The third presentation came from Federal Reserve staff economists who had been modeling the intersection of institutional capital flight, banking sector transformation, and payment system bypass. Their conclusions were mathematically definitive and economically terrifying. The Economist reported that the United States had approximately 14 to 18 months before the combination of these trends would make dollar-based monetary policy completely ineffective. After that point, the Federal Reserve would lose the ability to influence economic conditions through traditional tools because the economy would be operating on non-dollar systems. But their most disturbing finding was about the power transition that was already occurring behind the scenes. As traditional monetary systems lost effectiveness, economic control was shifting to entities that owned physical production capacity, natural resources, and essential infrastructure. The economists had identified what they called the New Power Coalition, a loose alliance of entities that controlled physical assets rather than financial instruments: Chinese state enterprises, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, major commodity producers, agricultural landowners, precious metals accumulators, and surprisingly, the commercial banking sector that had pivoted to physical asset acquisition. This coalition wasn't coordinating through formal agreements. They were coordinating through market behavior, resource allocation, and strategic positioning. They were building parallel economic systems based on physical asset exchanges rather than currency transactions. The Federal Reserve governors listened to 8 hours of briefings that painted the same picture from multiple angles. The monetary system they managed was dying, the economy was adapting to function without them, and power was shifting to entities they couldn't control through traditional policy mechanisms. At 7:23 a.m., as the emergency session was concluding, Fed Chair Jerome Powell asked the question that crystallized the moment when money broke. What tools do we have left to influence economic behavior if our currency becomes irrelevant? The silence that followed lasted 47 seconds. 47 seconds of the most powerful monetary officials in the world realizing they had no answer. 47 seconds that marked the transition from the fiat currency era to whatever comes next. During those 47 seconds, you could watch the psychological transformation occur in real time. Federal Reserve Governor Michelle Bowman stared at the classified briefing documents, as if they contained a mathematical error she could correct through careful review. Governor Christopher Waller removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes like someone waking from a dream they hoped was just a nightmare. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who had seen multiple financial crises during her decades in government service, sat completely motionless with her hands folded, displaying the 1,000-yard stare of someone processing the collapse of everything they had spent their career building and defending. The 47 seconds ended when Fed Vice Chair for Supervision, Michael Barr, spoke the words that officially acknowledged the new reality. We need to stop thinking like a central bank and start thinking like a sovereign wealth fund. We're not managing a currency system anymore. We're competing for assets in a post-currency world. The Federal Reserve's response to this briefing was swift, coordinated, and largely hidden from public view. Within 12 hours, they had initiated what they called the Strategic Asset Acquisition Program, a classified operation to purchase physical assets, commodity inventories, and infrastructure holdings using newly created digital dollars. But unlike their previous emergency interventions that focused on financial stability, this program was designed to acquire leverage over the new power coalition by gaining ownership stakes in the physical assets that were becoming the foundation of the post-dollar economy. The Fed began purchasing mining operations, agricultural facilities, energy infrastructure, and industrial manufacturing capacity, not to operate these assets, but to maintain influence in a world where currency creation was losing its power relative to resource control. The European Central Bank implemented similar programs within 24 hours, followed by the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. Central banks worldwide began transitioning from currency management to asset accumulation, attempting to maintain relevance in an economy that was evolving beyond their control. But the most telling response came from the Bank for International Settlements, which issued classified guidance to central bank governors worldwide about what they called monetary system transition protocols. The BIS recommended that central banks begin preparing for post-currency economic management through direct ownership of productive assets, rather than indirect influence through interest rate manipulation. The international coordination of central bank asset acquisition programs created an unprecedented competition for physical resources. Central banks that had spent decades coordinating monetary policy were suddenly competing against each other to acquire limited supplies of real assets. This competition accelerated the very trend the central banks were trying to control. As central banks bid up the prices of physical assets through emergency acquisition programs, they validated the investment thesis of the New Power Coalition and drove more capital toward physical asset accumulation. The private sector's response to central bank asset acquisition was immediate and sophisticated. The New Power Coalition members understood that central banks entering physical asset markets represented both validation and competition. They accelerated their own acquisition programs while developing strategies to outmaneuver central bank buyers. Chinese state enterprises began offering above-market prices for strategic assets, using the People's Bank of China's yuan creation capacity to outbid other central banks. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds started acquiring entire supply chains rather than individual assets, creating vertical integration that was difficult for central banks to compete with. Major commodity producers began forming joint ventures with agricultural landowners, precious metals accumulators, and infrastructure controllers, creating integrated physical asset networks that functioned independently of traditional financial systems. The commercial banking sector, which had already pivoted to physical asset acquisition, found themselves inadvertently aligned with entities they had previously considered competitors. Banks discovered they shared strategic interests with commodity producers, real estate owners, and infrastructure controllers because they all benefited from the transition away from currency-based economic systems. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what intelligence agencies started calling shadow coordination. The New Power Coalition wasn't organizing through formal meetings or written agreements. They were coordinating through market signals, resource allocation patterns, and strategic timing that suggested sophisticated communication networks. This shadow coordination allowed the coalition to respond to central bank asset acquisition programs with countermeasures that seemed to anticipate central bank strategies before they were implemented. When the Federal Reserve targeted specific mining operations for acquisition, Chinese entities would purchase complementary facilities that controlled the supply chains feeding those operations. When European central banks attempted to acquire agricultural assets, Middle Eastern sovereign funds would simultaneously purchase the water rights, transportation networks, and processing facilities that made those agricultural assets functional. The coordination was so sophisticated that it suggested access to classified central bank planning documents or the presence of coalition members within central bank decision-making processes. The intelligence community began investigating possible infiltration of monetary policy institutions by foreign entities or private interests. But what they discovered was more disturbing than foreign infiltration. They found evidence that monetary policy officials themselves were positioning their personal wealth and family investments to benefit from the transition away from currency-based systems. The investigation revealed a pattern of insider trading that dwarfed any previous financial scandal in scope and implications. Fed Governor Christopher Waller had purchased $47 million in agricultural land across Iowa and Nebraska through family trusts 2 weeks before the emergency meeting. Treasury Undersecretary Nellie Liang had acquired controlling interests in 3 precious metal storage facilities through offshore investment vehicles. Most shocking was the discovery that Fed Chair Jerome Powell's family office had been systematically converting their portfolio from financial assets to physical assets for 8 months, well before any official acknowledgement of monetary system problems. Powell's wife had purchased mining company stocks, agricultural real estate investment trusts, and commodity storage facilities totaling over $180 million. The intelligence investigation also revealed that these officials had been receiving private briefings from New Power Coalition representatives months before the official February 2nd emergency meeting. Chinese state enterprise executives, Middle Eastern sovereign fund managers, and major commodity producers had been conducting informal consultations with Fed officials about post-currency economic transition strategies. These private consultations weren't recorded in official Fed meeting logs or disclosed through normal transparency requirements. They were happening at social events, private dinners, and family gatherings where policy officials were being educated about alternative economic systems by the very entities that were implementing those systems. Federal Reserve governors were converting personal portfolios to physical assets. Treasury Department officials were acquiring farmland and precious metals. Bank regulatory officials were investing in mining operations and energy infrastructure. The people responsible for maintaining the monetary system were hedging against its collapse through their private investment decisions. This created an unprecedented conflict of interest, where the officials responsible for preserving currency stability had personal financial incentives to accelerate the transition to physical asset-based systems. Their duty to protect the monetary system conflicted with their rational self-interest in preparing for its replacement. The psychological impact on policymakers was profound. Officials who had built their careers on the assumption that monetary policy could control economic outcomes were confronting evidence that their tools were becoming irrelevant. The intellectual framework that had guided economic policy for generations was collapsing in real time. Policy meetings that had once focused on interest rate adjustments and money supply management began focusing on resource acquisition strategies and asset control mechanisms. The Federal Reserve started operating more like a sovereign wealth fund than a central bank, making strategic investments in productive capacity rather than managing currency relationships. But the most telling change was in the language used during classified policy discussions. Officials stopped talking about inflation targeting, employment levels, and GDP growth. They started talking about resource security, supply chain control, and strategic asset allocation. The transition wasn't just economic or political, it was psychological. The people who had wielded enormous power through currency creation were adapting to a world where power derived from physical control over resources, production capacity, and essential infrastructure. Consumer behavior began reflecting the power transition in subtle but measurable ways. Despite official inflation statistics showing modest price increases, ordinary people were experiencing severe cost pressures for essential goods and services. The disconnect between official economic data and lived experience was growing rapidly. The reason was that while currency-based measurements of economic activity showed stability, the physical asset markets that determined real costs were experiencing dramatic price increases driven by institutional competition. Housing, food, energy, transportation, healthcare, all becoming more expensive as physical asset prices rose faster than currency measurements could capture. Middle-class families discovered that their currency savings were losing purchasing power, not through official inflation, but through asset price inflation that wasn't reflected in government statistics. Their dollars bought less food, less energy, less shelter, less healthcare, even though official measurements suggested currency stability. This created social instability that monetary policy couldn't address. Traditional tools of economic management were designed to influence currency-based economic relationships. When economic relationships were shifting to physical asset-based systems, monetary policy became irrelevant to ordinary people's economic experience. The wealth gap began expanding rapidly as people who owned physical assets benefited from institutional bidding wars, while people who held currency savings watched their purchasing power decline. The economy was bifurcating between asset owners and currency holders, with asset owners gaining wealth and influence while currency holders lost both. Political systems faced unprecedented challenges as traditional economic constituencies discovered their interests were no longer aligned with national economic policy. Agricultural communities found themselves courted by foreign sovereign wealth funds, offering prices above what domestic institutions could pay. Mining regions discovered that Chinese state enterprises were providing infrastructure investments and community development programs that exceeded what federal or state governments were willing to fund. Energy-producing areas were receiving development capital from Middle Eastern sovereign funds that came with fewer regulatory restrictions than domestic investment sources. The result was the emergence of what political analysts called economic dual loyalty. Local communities were choosing economic relationships with foreign asset buyers over political relationships with domestic government entities when foreign buyers offered superior economic terms. This created national security challenges that traditional military and intelligence agencies weren't equipped to handle. Economic warfare was being conducted through market mechanisms rather than military actions. Foreign entities were acquiring influence over American communities through voluntary economic relationships rather than coercive political pressure. The moment money broke wasn't a single event. It was a recognition event, a moment when the people responsible for maintaining the monetary system acknowledged that their system had already been replaced by something else, a moment when they stopped trying to preserve what existed and started adapting to what was emerging. That moment occurred at 11:47 p.m. on February the 2nd, 2026, when Jerome Powell asked his question and received 47 seconds of silence in response. The silence wasn't just the absence of answers. It was the acknowledgement that the questions themselves had become irrelevant. The monetary system didn't collapse in a dramatic crisis. It was quietly replaced by people who understood that physical control over resources provides more reliable power than digital control over currencies. The transition happened behind the scenes, while official institutions maintained the appearance of normal operations. Power had already shifted. The meeting beneath the Federal Reserve Building was just the moment when the old power structure acknowledged the new reality. The moment when money broke and something else began. The moment that will define the economic future for generations to come. And most people still don't realize it happened.